welcome everybody to a very special edition of the Gut Health Masterclass. I'm here with my good friend Sayer G, and we've got a couple things we want to discuss. One is gut health. That's what we're here for, but also to discuss Sayer's new book, Regenerate, which is out now for pre-sale, right?
Yes.
And going to be out soon. March 31st is the release date.
You got it.
Amazing. So obviously, regeneration is a huge part of gut health. And I know with Green Med Info and everything that you do, you dig into an immense amount of research. So I wanted to talk to you about this idea of regeneration and how it ties into gut health. So in your book, is that something that you go into? I imagine it is. Gut health is such an important function. So what kind of aspects do you talk about in the book?
Sure. So Regenerate focuses a lot on just the way that we have transitioned from an old model of the body where, there isn't really a lot of focus on the microbiome.
Mm.
In fact, what I found so fascinating in writing the book was in 2000, you'd see maybe a couple dozen studies where the term microbiome comes up. And now today it's over 10,000 each year. And so that to me represented almost like an event horizon we passed through, where all the previous literature that had accumulated, which is what we base a lot of our medical understanding and the standard of care upon, was no longer valid because it didn't even account for the microbiome's critical role in health and wellness and disease risk. So it's almost as if in 2000, the reset button was hit and people were not really made aware that there was a new understanding of the body where we're actually dependent on these so-called germs that for many decades we thought were the primary cause of disease, and everything suddenly flipped. We realized that actually the microorganisms in the gut and around us, there's even a microbial cloud, right, that is off the surface of our body, like the aura, is essential for our health and wellness. So that's a big part of what the book goes into, the benefits, if you will, of horizontal, information transfer through viruses, for example.
Explain that. Horizontal information transfer. What's happening in that process?
Sure. Like one of the, really central dogmas of molecular biology was that information flows in one direction, right? That there's this privileged area in the nucleus of the cell that contains all the instructions for life.
It's like the hereditary flow, right?
Exactly. Is that the concept that the protein coding genes are like this, holy grail, that if we can just find out what they are, we'll have the blueprint for the protein based body map, and then we'll figure out everything.
It's like the instruction manual that doesn't get altered, right?
Exactly. And what happened in 2005 when the first draft of the Human Genome Project was completed, they were in great dismay because they're like, wait a second, there's only about 20,000 genes.
And I think it's gone down, right, over time.
Thank you.
Right.
It's actually gone down to about 18,000. Right. And so technically we have about the same amount of protein coding genes in the human genome as the earthworm has in its. And so there were all these people like, well, this is impossible. There's 100,000 proteins in a single human cell. So how could we not have that many genes to describe the blueprint? And so the beauty of that transition was it was the end of this faulty premise that, that we are just like cars on a conveyor belt, and, that this blueprint of the protein coding genes is the key. So what happened actually was this profound shift in understanding that information actually flows in both directions, and that we can't account for the miracle of the human body through this gene-based view. Reverse transcriptase, right? This is an enzyme found in retroviruses discovered in 1971, and it actually is able to put information back into the genome of the cell in the other direction. And so that was the beginning of people realizing, well, actually information flows in both directions, and that in many ways we're almost like an open source, decentralized network of relationships, like that our body and the holobiont, which speaks to your original question about the gut health, is comprised of these trillions of viruses and bacteria and fungi, even helminths, and that is mostly of what we are. The eukaryotic cells and the protein coding genes within them are a relatively small contribution to the genetic material in the whole self that we are.
So we're constantly responding to and adapting to and sending information back and forth with all these various genomes, it sounds like, both within us and outside of us. And so in that sort of bigger philosophy and understanding, then the gut and its microbiome and all the microbiota that make up those genes probably play a massive role in this bidirectional or multi-directional relationship.
Absolutely. In fact, I think one of the greatest discoveries is that if you look at the enzymes coded in the human genome, it's very sparse, carbohydrate digesting enzymes. There's only a few of them, right? But if you look at the bacteria in our gut and what they produce, there's tens of thousands of carbohydrate digesting enzymes they contribute. And what does that mean? Well, when you're trying to survive on this biosphere and there's a near infinite number of plants with carbohydrate that you can consume if you have certain enzymes, it's a matter of life or death. And so it's just the tip of the iceberg, because technically there are all these biosynthetic pathways that these microorganisms contribute, without which we wouldn't be here today speaking, that we need. And they produce really unique compounds for us. Some of them we know very well, like, you have the methylated form of folate produced by Lactobacillus plantarum. So even if you might have, these SNPs, you can fill in the genetic gaps with the aid of these bacteria that produce compounds for us that we can't genetically produce ourselves.
When we hear about this a lot, right? And a lot of it, times I've heard it, is in context of a vegan or vegetarian diet and these arguments that go back and forth. Well, if you're vegan, you can't produce vitamin B12 and you can't produce these things, right? Well, if we now understand that we have these bacteria and perhaps other organisms that are doing this work for us, I'm not arguing necessarily for a vegan approach, but it does give credence to the idea that we don't need to do everything ourselves, right? And so we have these aspects that, and to me, this speaks to a larger framework of cooperation, right? Of interdependency, of interbeing, as some of the Buddhists might talk about, right? So it's very interesting when we have that concept. And with the microbiota, it now seems like we can take a different frame of reference and say, hey, like, who can I partner with here to get the job done, right? So in your book or in your general philosophy of living, how do you do that? How do you think about cooperation with these other organisms? What do you do to foster that? Whether it be through diet or sleep or meditation, what is it that helps us increase this cooperative mechanism?
Well, I love that. The primary thing that I focus on is food quality. And that's a big premise of Regenerate, is that if we really look at food, conventionally speaking, we think of it as a source of calories or building blocks for the body machine. It's that simple, right? But actually, food is primarily a form of information and genetically essential information. So one of the aspects of that is each food we consume has a microbiome. That microbiome may be very toxic. I mean, if it's CAFO-raised, factory farmed animal waste or even human waste, night soil used to grow food, it may not have a very nice microbiome that we want to reseed our bodies with. But if it's biodynamically grown and there's old growth microorganisms, or even look at raw honey has a type of lactobacillus that's been working with the bee midgut for like at least 84 million years. It contributes this ancient, essential commensal bacteria without which we wouldn't be human probably. So when you start thinking about the important informational molecules found in food, some of them are actually living, they're constantly giving off what are known as exosomes. So this is a really key part of the new biology, which is that every cell that's living produces these nanoparticles about the size of a virus, maybe 50 nanometers across, and they contain within them, these particles contain within them these microRNAs. And now why is that important? Because after the first draft of the Human Genome Project was completed, and they're like throwing up their hands, well, there's not enough protein coding genes to explain our complexity. We're just like earthworms. Then they realized, well, the dark matter of the human genome, which is something I think Jeffrey Bland sometimes calls it, actually contains a lot of RNAs, which are extremely important. Now, these RNAs, including the microRNAs, actually appear to be like master regulators that supervene upon the protein coding genes and help to orchestrate their expression.
Like the managers.
The managers, yeah. And it's like the keys of a piano.
Right.
You can create a near infinite amount of
Right.
patterns. And so the complexity now we're seemingly being able to attribute to the so-called junk DNA, 98% that was considered useless, that is constantly transcribed into RNAs. So it's almost like this sea of RNAs that we overlooked because we were focused on proteins, that now we're realizing contain a lot of the magic of what it is to be human and how the whole dance of life works. So now, interestingly, these exosomes produced by all cells are actually found to, orchestrate the expression of our DNA. Let's say we're eating rice. There's exosomes within them that will have the ability to go into the human gut. They're metabolized, but they go through into the blood, and then they alter, for example, the LDL receptor, which can greatly affect lipid blood profiles and therefore cardiovascular health risk, etc. So we're starting to understand how these little biologically essential master regulator molecules that are nucleic acids, very important, are actually helping to govern the expression of our genome, and they're in food. So food becomes as essential to understanding our own DNA and optimizing it as the very protein coding genes within the nucleus.
So we're learning to play the piano, really, with all these different things, right? And I love this because take a peach, for example, right? When I get a peach from Whole Foods, right? It may be organic, it may not be, but it's probably been sprayed with bromine or chlorine or something like that. And so just thinking about the nuanced nature of buying an organic peach from a grocery store versus going and picking an organic peach off of a tree, the biome is going to be different, right? So it's like this interaction in so many ways of the food that we're consuming, right? So it takes that food discussion to completely a different level, right? A much deeper level.
Oh, it's such a great topic. We're sort of scratching the surface because when it comes to the peach, for example, the microbiome of the environment alone will affect the polyphenol content of that fruit. And that's an informational molecule. I mean, we know it primarily as an antioxidant, but it's produced in times of stress. And so a non-conventional, like regular, wild, crafted, or organic piece of fruit will have sometimes orders of magnitude greater levels of these polyphenols. Now, they won't look as beautiful. They'll be scratched up and maybe a bug tried eating it. It's usually a good sign. That will have significant effects at optimizing the expression of resiliency, longevity patterns within our genome. So in other words, we're starting to understand the essential link between, plants living out there, seemingly independent, but actually that have an interest in conferring longevity and resilience to us. Because why is that? Well, turns out that animals are dispersing seeds for these fruit-bearing plants, the angiosperms, and they have a powerful vested interest in helping us to be stronger and to help us reproduce better. So that's what's so fascinating in the research I've done with GreenMed Info is you take out all these ovaries of these animals, right, to induce osteoporosis and menopausal symptoms. And you give a certain group, plum or orange or pomegranate or grape, and it's as if you've never taken their ovaries out. So the fruiting ovaries of these plants are actually very much like software, for our hardware. And they do confer longevity in a very powerful way. It's because animals and plants have been linked for millions of years, and they have interest in helping each other ultimately. You call it reciprocal altruism, if you will. So it's a different way of understanding why food is so powerful, a healing and longevity promoting thing.
I love this. And just to sort of, drive home that point that you're talking about, when things are grown in the wild, I like to think of wine, red wine, because it's something that we kind of understand a little bit, right? People think about it sometimes, but it's the pressure, at which altitude it's grown, the temperature or the amount of UV light, right? So like a Malbec grape might have a really thick skin, developing more polyphenols, right? So even on a peach, you might have a slightly thicker skin, it's got more color inside, whatever it is to protect and create a defense and resiliency in that peach that we sort of then steal, right? And I use that word lightly. We borrow, we integrate those patterns or those qualities
Mhm.
into our being, right?
Yes, and in fact, the thing about the grape is that it really needs us to be well and to survive the same conditions that may be emerging. It could be drought, it could be pestilence, but for us to be alive and well is essential for it. So it may communicate through these polyphenols the similar effects to caloric restriction because there's impending shortness of resources. That way, we're going to continue to help it replicate.
So it's teaching us, it's educating us on the environmental conditions.
Exactly. And that's part of what's sometimes called the xenohermetic hypothesis, is that these compounds or secondary plant metabolites are conferring longevity wellness factors to us because we're linked, if you will, karmically or even intentionally. It's a very interesting concept, but I think it makes a lot of sense. And ultimately, it's ancestral foods that have such great value as software to our hardware. You add in, modern GMO, conventionally produced foods, especially ones that are now being produced by big chemical companies, Dow and Monsanto, while it was still around, now it's Bayer, produce an RNA interference corn. It's a way of basically taking the discoveries of the post-genomic era and applying it in a very dark way because they're using these RNAs to silence genes, theoretically in the corn rootworm, the billion-dollar pest. But unfortunately, because of the redundancy throughout life, those same genes are found in humans. So when this corn comes onto the market, which is this year, there are going to be a massive amount of, quote, off-target adverse effects in this pesticidal GMO. It's called RNAi corn. And it's just speaking to the dangers, unfortunately, of the interdependence we have, informationally with food.
How do we identify if we're getting this corn? I mean, I guess non-GMO is an organic corn is the best way to really avoid that.
Yes, that's unfortunately the problem. Is at this point we just have the USDA organic or non-GMO certified, process to help us to keep from being exposed. But I think it's about education. When people start understanding the power of RNA, really, and start realizing that these big corporations have already taken this over, it's because it does have such a profound effect on our body.
Yeah, and I think that if anything, the previous point that you made is so important because growing something in a wild condition or at home or whatever, despite the label of organic, that's going to have such a profound difference maker in our body. And of course, I think we also have to take a step back and look at the timeline of all this, right? Changing your dietary habits and this new level of thinking isn't necessarily going to confer changes and epigenetic switches overnight. I mean, sure, it is on micro levels, but in terms of us recognizing the benefits, it may take years of changes in order to recognize the benefits. But, I know with your book and the stuff that I work on too, this idea of longevity doesn't happen overnight either, right? Becoming a centenarian is a 100-year process, right? So I think we have to sort of change our perspective a little bit on these things. And from my perspective, it's also important that we make these decisions not only for us but for the benefit of all, right? And so there's another level to all this. I think that we have the opportunity to look at.
This is a really great point. And interestingly, one of the key revolutionary studies in molecular biology came about in 2013 when they found that the so-called Weismann barrier had been overcome. Well, the Weismann barrier was basically the concept that genetic information is locked within the nucleus, right? And you can only send information down the line reproductively through that process. But now we know through exosomes, again, which carry these microRNAs, which are nucleic acids that govern the expression of our entire genome, they can send messages from soma cells to germline cells. So they found that a body cell will send information to sperm, which then can get carried on for the infinite more generations. So what that means is in real time, something that's happening to you, it could be an emotion having a physiological effect. It could be toxicant exposure. It could be any number of things will have a direct effect genetically on the next generation and so forth and so on. Now, on some level, that sounds terrifying and like, wow, what a massive responsibility. Because previously the thought was with these glacial pace changes of these primary nucleotide sequences, it would take 1 million years for a mutation to occur.
Right.
Now we know it can happen any moment. And that is tremendous empowerment. And it's also great responsibility. It should mean that we can reverse certain trajectories towards chronic disease as well in this moment. But it's pretty intense information. Yeah.
Well, it is. It's a great responsibility. And, when we look at the state of the U.S. right now, right, with cancer rates insanely elevated, autism, heart disease, you name it, we're going through the roof and all these things. When you look at the charts, it's astronomical and it's scary looking. But with this information, this is how we can reverse that ski slope of a trajectory instantaneously, so quickly. We don't have to sort of slow it down and eventually taper it off over decades and hundreds of years, but we can do this quick.
I believe that's true. And I think that one of the promises of the new biology is that, there's a profound resilience that every cell in our body has access to that does in some cases cause radical remission of acute chronic disease. There's so many anecdotes out there. They're not going to make it into your typical multi-center randomized double-blind or triple-blind placebo trial. It's just financially not feasible. It's just not something that's really going to happen. But we know that people have access to this resilience because the very cells in our body are quasi-immortal. And when I say quasi-immortal, that's conservative, because if you look back, right, to the last universal common ancestor cell, approximately 3.4 billion years ago, every single living thing on this planet shared an ancestor cell. And that cell itself may have been deposited here through the panspermia hypothesis, through maybe some kind of fungal life form. So it's possible that life is literally immortal and eternal. And that's fascinating because the germline cells, like in our testes in a woman's ovary, have been replicating for a near infinite amount of time since, so we have that seed of immortality. And I found it fascinating because even the book of my cover has this Romanesco cauliflower. It has the Fibonacci series in it. It's fractal or quasi-fractal, but it has this meristematic stem cell at the top of the curve of the spiral, and it's transducing massive amounts of biomass out of pretty much nowhere.
Nothing.
Yeah, it's like an
It's
airplane.
almost like the 0 point, right? Where the information is contained.
Thank you. That's it. In fact, I know you have conversations with Nassim, and so that's amazing because exactly. So no one can explain the immortality of the meristematic cell. I mean, there are plants that are over 40,000 years old that have been propagating clonally just through the replication of these cell lines. I believe they're transducing from the quantum vacuum the energy and information required to produce this really infinite biomass. And so this is just a beautiful representation of what's happening within our bodies. And we can focus on the germline cells, but the reality is all the tissues in our body have these stem cells. And they are actually also at the root of the most feared diseases of all time. Cancer is really a cancer stem cell based phenomenon where something goes awry. These cells that have been charged with regenerating damaged tissue replicate in a way that can lead to tissue abnormality and in some cases uncontrolled growth. The reality though is those cells have been there trying to heal us over and over again, 24/7. If you consider the non-native EMF and the 100,000 plus novel anthropogenic petrochemical derived toxicants we're exposed to, of course the body should be pretty much dying.
It's amazing that we're alive. It's amazing that we're thriving considering all of that, right?
You got it.
It's pretty remarkable. I wanted to ask you, what's the point of your book? Why did you write it? What was your initial sort of message that you really wanted to convey?
Well, I think it was really just this flash of insight around our incredible resilience. Like my story is in the first chapter, which is I was born in the world a sick infant, constantly being rushed to the emergency room, getting injected with epinephrine for bronchial asthma. And I just did not have a happy infanthood or childhood or adolescence. And so I knew what it was like to be really sick and depressed and just feel isolated. And it took me a long time to get to the point where I really started to feel this resilient core. Mm-hmm. So I overcame a lot to get to that point. But my real hope was that people would start to really understand that the new biophysics, if you will, promises us just this tremendous ability to heal and take back control of our health destiny. So it was like a flash of insight at the real miracle and abundance and superfluity of life that we're afforded. There's so many reasons to get depressed. Like I've spent so many years with Green Med Info, identifying the 1,000 studies on why Roundup and statin drugs and vaccines are a problem. And after a while, it just becomes its own disease because you're just constantly fighting this paradigm. And I just wanted people to have exposure to a paradigm that supplants a lot of the concern and darkness associated with like my older advocacy. So I want them to get excited. I want them to feel it. I'm giving them certain techniques, like I suggest doing the mono diet of eating organic apples for a day. Just go off the grid of conventional eating and
play around with things.
Just take advantage of this amazing, perfect food and the energy and information that you can access that's not even physical. I mean, there's really a cosmic stream of nutrition. It's what Rudolf Hashka used to talk about. And it's available to us. It's happening in all our cells. I go into, examples of like the mantis shrimp that is able to induce water cavitation with its strike of its claw, and it's basically producing temperatures as hot as is found on the surface of the sun. I mean, it's using its claw to transduce the quantum vacuum and create this heat and light and mechanical effects. So we can do the same. I'm convinced of it.
It's funny you mentioned the apple, because I remember in Okinawa when we were there for the Human Longevity Project, and one of the gals there they were educating me on how they perceive food. That all of the food that they interact with, at least the people that are aware, that what they try to convey to children is that these foods carry an energy, an archetype, if you will. Mm-hmm. So the apple is a toroidal shape. It's this universal feminine that is impregnated in the middle. It has these cavitations in the middle with the seed, right? So it's like pregnant with life in it. So it's interesting, right? When you think about these things from a deeper level and what they may convey. Now, what to do with that information, I'm not sure, other than to maybe open my awareness to what these food represent, right? I mean, you have a food on the cover of your book that is illustration of that same example of a deeper meaning, of a deeper archetypal energy that we can interact with, right?
I love this. I wish I had known about this before writing my book, because that's exactly what happens in water cavitation. Is that they discovered this in propellers of ships, is that there's, after time, the blades get worn out because these little bubbles are formed. They're like exotic steam bubbles, and they implode upon themselves, and they produce this toroid. And then within it, massive amounts of heat are generated and light. And according to the work,
it's like a little Big Bang.
It's like a little Big Bang, yes, because Mark Leclerc, the nanotechnologist specialist who discovered this application, was able to induce a micro nucleosynthesis event with water cavitation, which generated the entire periodic chart of elements. And it's just like you said with the seed, because there is something so special about apple seeds, I believe, in all seeds, is they have potential infinite forests within them. And where does that come from?
It goes back to your point here, which is very interesting, right? And to a bigger message that I find so fascinating. We think about Luca and this infinite mortality that we have. Yeah. And Terence McKenna sort of turned me onto this idea that life doesn't seem to be getting simpler and regressing. It's getting more complex. Right? So this is very interesting. So things are getting more complicated, not less. You would think that if it's as we're told, that we're divulging that there's this dissipation of energy, this dissipation of heat, so to speak, that things sort of settle, but they're not. They're getting more complicated. They're getting more complex. And something like any kind of a tree that gives off a cone, it's just spreading its seed. And now you have one tree that turns into essentially infinite trees, right? So it's very interesting when you go down these rabbit holes of information, but thinking about these things on another level, I think, does induce this idea that we have a regenerative capacity within ourselves to heal from a fundamentally different perspective.
I love this because, like, for example, people are like, well, this is quackery. Like, how can you create something out of nothing? And yet most conventional, explanations for the origin of the universe now account for this Big Bang event. We had a very big something come out of a very small nothing. And so, a lot of what the book focuses on is actually this new concept that the quantum vacuum, right? This 0 point energy is available in a way that is so obvious. Like if you look at the inner mitochondrial membrane, you find an electric field strength potential of 30 million volts. That's the same as discharged by a lightning bolt in one mitochondrion.
Right.
And according to Jack Kruse and others that I've explored, there's the ability to convert light in the mitochondrion to matter, programmable matter, and biotransmutation of elements. And this sounds like alchemy, but it's happening. It's a biological cold fusion, and it accounts for the miracle of the body. And so that's sort of where we're going, I think, in this next phase, is acknowledging this is one of the most miraculous, resilient technologies on the planet. I mean, this Army researcher covered in the book found in the 1970s that the mitochondria are like cyclotron particle accelerators. Like they're literally obeying the same rules on a nano level. And so I think once we start tapping into this realm, the sky's the limit. People aren't going to be like, oh, you can't cure cancer, or you need to be on a statin drug for blood cholesterol. And it's so ancient thinking relative to this practically ET technology that we inhabit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've in the book that I'm writing, I get into a lot of these deeper ideas, and just in terms of exploring the thought ideas, the concepts of these, right? Something like giving birth, or like when we get pregnant, right? Sperm meets egg. We have one cell that turns into 2, into 4, into 16, right? How does a cell eventually become a liver cell, a kidney cell, an eye cell, skin, hair? How does this actually happen? Right? There's some kind of template there. There's some kind of field that is guiding this intelligence, right? And we are literally creating something out of nothing, or many things out of one thing, right? So it's very interesting, and I think it's such an important idea, even if we don't take it to its full understanding of how it's happening. It's, in my opinion, a very critical concept when we explore the idea of healing. Because we're so often told that when we have cancer, when we have rheumatoid arthritis, when we have colitis or Crohn's or macular degeneration, whatever it might be, that it's irreversible. And that's fundamentally working against the idea that we are creating something or many things out of one thing or nothing. And to me, it opens up the possibilities that we can undo, we can reverse, we can regenerate on an amazing number of levels, no matter what our age is. And I think it's oftentimes our mind that gets in the way. And this gets into a lot of the concepts that science has already explored and continues to explore when it comes to the placebo effect or the nocebo effect, right? So is this something you cover in your book, the mindset idea?
Absolutely. When it comes to cancer specifically, which is sort of the greatest medical psyop of our time, insofar as the basic understanding is it is inexorably lethal. It might as well be this juggernaut of death, when in fact it's something the body's doing. So, I wrote another book with Dr. Ben Lerner and Charles Majors years ago called Cancer Killers. And the basic premise is like, we don't get sick because we have cancer. We get cancer because we're already sick, right? So that it's very simple, really, in premise. But the reality is that cancer is the body's attempt to heal, and it is literally an example of our cells immortalizing. Literally, you could take chemical weapons grade, chemotherapy and radiotherapy, which is quite an Orwellian term. You could throw it at this cell, literally lethal doses, and it's sitting there laughing and growing stronger. Of course, that's scary to us because we have this very old world model of like, we just have to kill it, and destroy it like a terrorist. And who cares about the collateral damage, and it's preemptive war. But the reality is that is a sign of just how powerfully resilient our body is in face of what are highly unnatural and inappropriate exposures. Those are dietary, they're environmental, they're electromagnetic, and they're psychogenic. So when it comes to the psychogenic component, it turns out there was a very powerful study the Swedes did. It was 500,000 individuals, and they looked at what happened when they gave people who went in for cancer tests their diagnoses. And when they were told that they had a positive cancer diagnosis, their suicide rates skyrocketed, of course. But the real interesting example was that their chance of dying from heart-related death skyrocketed as well. Within 1 week, for the worst prognosis, it was 26.9-fold increased risk of heart-related death, like a heart attack, because they basically died broken, because they were basically, bone pointed, like a shaman in a tribe saying, you're going to die. I'm pointing this magical stick at you, and then the person believes them and they go and die the next day. That's what's happening with the cancer epidemic, because everyone's being told, oh my God, you have cancer, you have 6 months to live, and if you're going to do chemo radiation, you're going to die. If they knew the truth, which is their body is doing whatever it can to try to survive the toxicant load and all the inappropriate foods, etc., then they could reverse it. This is something that can happen, and that's what people need to be told. And once they believe it, they can make it possible. But like you said, the nocebo effect and the mind connection is everything.
It seems to me this is the origin. People like to dismiss the idea of a hex or a curse. And to me, this is exactly what a curse is. It's me giving you a reality, and you buying right into that, creating that reality, manifesting that reality, following that path that you don't need to, but you are actually cooperatively playing into.
Totally, yes.
Right? So it's not this, it's almost a participatory event. If I put a curse on you, I'm literally walking you down a path, and you're following that path. And this is what's happening.
Exactly. It's like crystal ball reading, although I don't mean to disparage crystal ball reading because it's less evolved on some level, but prognosis literally means pre-knowing. It's a form of scrying, or just guessing. And again, people don't realize that they're giving all their power to these men and women in white coats. It might as well be some kind of ancient priest, and that it's time for us to truly understand that the body, when understood from a perspective of compassion, and again, the new understanding of biophysics, we can be liberated to heal from virtually anything, if not anything.
So, you talked about some of these external substances that we can look to in our environment that are so, we're so afraid of, right? The EMFs and the toxins and the chemicals and the metals. I see this a lot on a micro level with the gut, right? We talk about NSAIDs and birth control pills and all the pharmaceuticals that we're taking that are disrupting the gut. And it's quite daunting, right? You talk about the glyphosates and the pesticides and herbicides and all the things that we're now, with the recent science, we're identifying the mechanisms of these things. And to me, there's this fundamental shift that can take place if we're open to it, which is to acknowledge those realities, that they do exist, and also stepping into our power. So I'm curious, in your life, how have you managed that? Was there a turning point for you that you recognize this sort of reality that, yes, there are these things in our environment that are just absolutely wrecking us, and also I have the capacity to work around them and sort of overcome them, understanding that I have this amazing infinite capacity to regenerate and heal?
Yeah, for me, I think a lot of it had to do with my fixation on supplementation for a while.
Yeah.
It's like I was reduplicating the same psychology around, pill for an ill, or if I take this handful of protective supplements, then somehow the toxicants aren't going to be as harmful, to then switching more to just having greater faith on my body with the right food, the right intentionality, the right physical practice, being able to take care of itself. So it's not that I don't supplement, I do, but I'm very cautious now about the energy I'm putting into it. If it's a fear-based or, my cheating nature versus relying on my body to just really take care of things and having confidence that it will. So that's been part of it for me. And
that's very subtle, right? What you're talking about there. I just want to sort of highlight this and point to this, because I think it's important that we tend to live in this either or reality. Supplements are going to fix me. And then the other side of that is, no, I have an amazing capacity to heal myself. I don't need supplements. And then you run away from them. And to me, what I found is this nuanced in-between place where we can sort of partner with supplements and then the external aspects of things, and also recognizing that there's an immense ability inside to heal. And so that's so nuanced to be able to work in that middle ground, to not deny that reality. Because if something can help me, whether it's a pharmaceutical drug in the short term, or a supplement, an herb, or just maybe it's a breath work or something else to that effect, right? Like
Yeah.
there's such a nuanced reality there, and I think it's important to at least honor that that middle ground, to not shun all that stuff,
Yes.
but also not explicitly rely only on the external world.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think I had sort of been putting most of my faith in, like, okay, natural alternatives are better.
Right.
And then just focus my energy there, whereas having more of an innate confidence that my body is capable. For example, like this work around biotransmutation of elements. I cover it in my book historically. It was Louise Kevron who, in the sort of post-nuclear era, started to actually do a lot of testing on, doing experiments that are very controlled, showing that biological systems can convert elements into one another, which seems to violate basic laws of chemistry. And so we've discovered that
When you say elements, what do you mean? What kind of elements?
So, like,
For
for example, the classical example is chickens, right? And cows. They're consuming not that much calcium in their diet, but they're excreting massive amounts of calcium. So there's always this question mark: where are they getting the
How are they
calcium
doing
from?
this? Right.
And it turns out they're capable. It sounds like someone's milking
I
a
know.
cow right now, Bessie out there. It's the elements. We love it in Florida. But anyway, so there is a lot of evidence that our body can transmute through low energy nuclear transformation, meaning without high temperature and high pressure, like you would in, say, a nuclear reactor, elements into one another. It could be silica to calcium, potassium, and magnesium. And so that helps to better account for why we don't necessarily need to optimize perfectly every meal, the exact right amount of mineral, because our body has more flexibility than we've given it credit. It was almost as if, like, our body's a little infant. We have to find just the right amount of each ingredient, otherwise we're going to die.
Right. Our mind is so much smarter than our body. That's how we operate, right?
Right, exactly. And I think we're starting to learn that, really we're a body mind, and there's infinite intelligence distributed through all things, but our body is capable of amazing feats. And when it comes to gut health and this connection, there's a lot of research now, radiobiology research on certain bacteria are capable of not only living off of really toxic elements like uranium-238, but are able to transform these radioisotopes into less toxic ones. So that there's even so in other words, our guts are constantly protecting us in ways that we had no clue. Like, if it can help to bioremediate or mitigate constant low dose radiation exposure, which is happening. I mean, we have uranium and plutonium now in the food chain, in our environment. That's a pretty significant finding. And so, I think all the more reason why our gut needs to be replenished constantly with really good bacteria.
And even fungi, right? I remember a while back watching a video that Paul Stamets, who's sort of the fungi guy, he put out showing piles of dirt, and one pile of dirt was covered in oil. Actually, they were all drenched in oil, and this was, I think, due to an oil spill, and they used fungi, spores in one of the mounds, and it basically ate up the oil and turned that petrochemical into food, and they were flourishing. So you took non-living, if you want to think about it in terms of just material reality, substances just produced tons of life.
Definitely. That's part of this amazing discovery that our biosphere, like our gut, because we're sort of like a microcosm, regardless, our flora comes ultimately from our environment, is capable of regenerating, in a way that I never really thought was possible till recently, So I'm excited about the prospects of this because, even in the sense that microRNAs open up what is known as cross-kingdom communication. So, in other words, plants and animals used to be believed to have totally different genetic situations. You can't penetrate horizontally. Now we know through microRNA, constantly there's intercourse. Like, we excrete the food we eat, the plants are taking that up, including microRNAs, changing their gene expression, and we're eating their fruits and other parts, and it's changing our gene expression. So there's almost like a nascent Gaia hypothesis affirmation in this, is that there's now a plausible mechanism to help explain how there's constant communication occurring horizontally across all parts of life. And so it's interesting. Our fates are so connected, right? So as we put energy into healing the biosphere, there's an immediate effect that will happen on us microcosmically and vice versa.
It's amazing to me. The deeper you look into this stuff, the more complicated it gets, but also the more fundamental it gets, I think, right? It just speaks to this idea that everything you do, everything you think, everything you feel has an effect on one way or another on not only your physical body, but everything that you interact with, right? So it's tremendously empowering in my mind, but it also lends to this idea that that we have an opportunity to be mindful in so many areas. And that to me is really the idea of true regeneration, is being so mindful of what we're doing and saying and thinking and feeling that will then exhibit in so many of the ways that we interact with the inner and outer world, that then of course is in constant communication with us, right? Through these horizontal and vertical systems of communication that is so complex.
I love that, because see, I can get very focused on the new biology, the new physics, if you will. But you might as well talk about the new psychology and how there really is a top-down hierarchy, if you will, of priority. That our minds are so potent psychogenic, systems that like for example, coronavirus, everyone's freaking out about. I'm convinced if you believe that there's such a deadly little infinitesimal particle out there, even though we know there's trillions of them right here, right now, that could kill you if you just touch it. I am convinced you can implode. Like that. I mean, literally, people have been known to spontaneously combust. That the brain and the psyche and the soul is so powerful that you could kill yourself with a belief. So that can work for our good or for our harm.
Absolutely, and I know we're doing a lot of work with indigenous cultures and shamans, and in their cultures they develop such a intimate relationship with life and death that they consciously choose to exit the body at some point. That's how they operate in their culture. And I know this is similar things happen in the yogic cultures and the Buddhist cultures as well. So there does seem to be this amazing capacity for the mind, not the brain, but the mind that interacts with the physical nature of our reality, that it can do amazing things. Last question, because I know we've got to wrap up. What do you want people to take away from your book? How can we regenerate? What is the fundamental message that we can take from this thing that I can actually apply, that it is grounded in my reality?
It's a great question. The fundamental takeaway is simply that we are capable of healing without any external support. Like, I believe that truly, like on the deepest level. It's not that anyone, even myself, is going to experience that in this life. I just know we're capable of it, and people should know that. So there's always an option. There's always an alternative. And that's something that, with Green Med Info, we've been advocating for many years, and that we found all the research, hopefully, that anyone could need proving that there's at least some evidence that, yes, there are alternatives. So I want people to have hope. I want them to feel that their body is this incredible, resilient, ecstatic bliss technology. What I mean by that is, like, I was a very sick child and I suffered a lot when I was younger. And it was only over time I got to know what it felt like to have a runner's high, or to dance, to drum, to sing, to be in contact with nature. And those are things that we need more than anything. It's medicine on the highest level, and it has direct physical effects. So I would argue that this is something that the book is also leading people in the direction of, is let's leave behind the reductionism and this concept of we need pills, natural or synthetic, but let's get back to the soulful nature of who we fundamentally are. And then as far as takeaways, as far as implementation, again, I feel like it's really simple. When I first did a water fast, it was really powerful and I had a lot of really great effects from it, but it wasn't the same thing as when I just ate apples. It's just simple. You're nourishing yourself. If you're hungry, you just eat another apple. You may find that you really don't have true hunger if you don't want to eat another one. You can't hurt yourself by eating apples. So try that for a day and see how it opens up space in your life and just starts to give you access to this field that is there, that we can get our energy and information from. So I feel like that's one fun thing that people can try, and then they might start feeling more intimately the promise of regeneration.
Beautiful. I think it's what I take away from that message fundamentally is that we have tremendous power, and it's about implementing that power and really operating from direct experience. That's what I really heard from this Apple thing, right? Because you're talking, I've never done this, and I'm actually curious now.
Yeah.
Despite what you said, I'm now curious from my own experience. What am I going to take away from this sort of Apple experiment? Because it's inevitably going to speak to me in a different way, right? And so there's so much power in that. I love that.
Awesome.
I know you have a course with this book as well. So please tell people where they can get the book and also about this course.
Sure. Well, the book hopefully is available through your local bookseller. I've started to realize the Amazon Death Star, while giving us plenty of benefits, is not going to deliver the same spiritual value as going to indiebound.com, and it has these local directories so you can get it from your local bookseller. And then as far as the masterclass, I mean, it's available at regeneratemasterclass.com. And it's just, me trying to distill some of the fundamental points and get people excited about, the promise of the new biology and help to move us past what is fundamentally about, I'd say it's about a 500-year detour, this sort of like Newtonian Cartesian detour from really understanding what our body is, which again is a miraculous technology for bliss, connection, healing, and that's what it's here for.
Beautiful. And I think that's such an important message to exit on, because we have Silicon Valley, and we have these technologies that are coming about in an artificial way. To me, we have the option to follow that path fully, or we can sort of disconnect to some degree from that and get back to ourselves and trust this organic biology, this organic technology, which is so insanely powerful. So thank you so much for delivering that message. And thank you guys for joining us on this very special episode of Gut Health Roundtable. Go check out Sayer's book. He is an encyclopedia of wisdom, so I can only imagine what is in there. But fundamentally, the message is critical, I think. So again, thank you so much. We'll see you on the next one.